Let's jump right into today's explainer. We're looking at the Lindsay Clancy trial, specifically the incredibly complex intersection of clinical testimony and strict legal standards. If you've been tracking this case, you know it's a devastating one, and it is every bit as intricate medically as it is legally. Today, we're zeroing in on day 12 of the trial. We're going to break down exactly what the psychiatric nurse practitioner's testimony established, and honestly, what it didn't establish about clinical observations, fragmented treatment information, and how all of this collides with Massachusetts' two-pronged criminal responsibility test. Now, before we really get going, I need to make one thing absolutely clear. As of our factual cutoff on August 12, 2026, this trial is still ongoing. There is no verdict yet, so we're going to look strictly at the admissible evidence presented in the courtroom so far. We want to separate the verified testimony from all the online speculation out there. We aren't here to play jury, right? We're just here to understand the very specific framework the actual jury is going to have to use.
Okay, so here's our roadmap to keep things focused. We'll start with the current case status and remember the victims. Then we'll dive right into Day 12's medical testimony, the cross-examination about fragmented care, and that strict legal definition of criminal responsibility. We'll wrap up with the post-verdict process and, of course, some important crisis resources. Let's get to it.
Part 1, current status and the victims. To ground our explainer in reality, we absolutely must respectfully remember the victims at the center of this tragedy. That's Cora, who is 5, Dawson, 3, and baby Callan, who is just 8 months old. The defendant, their mother Lindsay Clancy, is facing 3 counts of first-degree murder, and she has pleaded not guilty. Now, the defense actually doesn't dispute that Clancy caused the children's deaths. Instead, the entire trial really hinges on her mental state at the time. And that brings us to the core legal dispute the jury is wrestling with. On one side, you have the prosecution asserting that her conduct was deliberate, making her criminally responsible under the law. But on the flip side, the defense is arguing a complete lack of criminal responsibility due to severe mental illness. And that includes alleged postpartum psychosis, bipolar spectrum illness, and the complex effects of various medications she was taking. Moving on to Part 2, Day 12, Medication and Testimony. So moving into the courtroom, the medical record really took center stage on Day 12. The focus was heavily on her psychiatric treatment prior to January 24, 2023. Psychiatric nurse practitioner Rebecca Jollotta took the stand. She actually treated Clancy before the tragedy, so her testimony gave everyone this critical window into what was clinically documented at the time. Jollotta testified that Clancy was reporting some really severe symptoms: deep depression, insomnia, just severe distress all around. She also documented that Clancy was having intrusive and suicidal thoughts. And on top of that, they had significant discussions about changing her medications because Clancy was expressing a lot of concern about side effects and dependency, especially with a medication called Ativan. But you know what's equally critical here? It's what was explicitly not seen. Jollotta testified that Clancy did not report any plan to harm another person. And, perhaps most significantly for the prosecution's case, Jollotta stated point blank that she did not observe psychosis during her clinical encounters with the defendant prior to January 24. For jury sitting there, hearing a treating clinician say they didn't see psychosis, that's a massive piece of the puzzle. But as we're about to see, clinical observations are really only as solid as the information they're based on. Which leads us to Part 3, Fragmented Care and Cross-Examination. This was a truly pivotal moment in the trial. During cross-examination, the defense basically put the completeness of this entire medical record under a microscope. They were asking the jury to consider, did nurse practitioner Jollotta actually have the whole picture of the defendant's mental health journey? Can severe symptoms or even a total catastrophic illness evolve completely under the radar if the treating clinician is only seeing a tiny fraction of the patient's record? When we look at what came out during cross-examination, a much more complicated narrative emerges. Yes, Jollotta documented depression and intrusive thoughts, but she acknowledged on the stand that she literally didn't have all the information from Clancy's other treating providers. And while she noted no observed psychosis, she admitted she hadn't consulted every psychiatrist involved in Clancy's care. She didn't even have complete records from the hospitals Clancy visited. The care was incredibly fragmented. And the defense's strategy here is pretty clear. They want to show that just because one provider didn't observe psychosis, that doesn't definitively rule it out. Why? Because the healthcare system itself may have failed to connect the dots on a patient who was rapidly deteriorating. Let's move to Part 4, Clinical Observation versus Criminal Responsibility. Now, this sets up the crucial divide between clinical evidence and strict legal standards. The jury doesn't just get to play doctor. They are tasked with applying the Massachusetts Criminal Responsibility Test, a medical diagnosis of postpartum psychosis, even if every single doctor agreed on it, is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. The jury has to decide if, because of a mental disease or defect, the defendant lacked substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of her conduct or to conform her conduct to the requirements of the law. It's a very specific two-pronged test. You can have a severe mental illness and absolutely still be found criminally responsible if the jury believes you understood what you were doing was wrong and you could control your actions. And because of that strict two-pronged test, an immense weight is suddenly placed on the prosecution. You see, once the defense properly raises the issue of criminal responsibility, and they absolutely have in this case, the burden of proof completely shifts. The Commonwealth must now prove that the defendant was criminally responsible beyond a reasonable doubt. Think about how hard that is. They have to prove she had the capacity to understand her actions and conform to the law, despite all her documented mental distress and the highly fragmented care she received.
Part 5. The post-verdict legal process.
Since we're dealing with all these complex legal definitions, we really need to clear up a major public misconception right now. There's this frequent misunderstanding that if a jury returns a verdict of not criminally responsible, the defendant just walks out the door a free person that day. That is absolutely false. Massachusetts law actually dictates a rigid, highly structured process. It starts with immediate court-ordered hospitalization for observation, followed by formal psychiatric examinations, potential petitions for long-term commitment, and continuing rigorous judicial review. An acquittal on these grounds is really a shift to a medical and judicial hold, definitely not an immediate release back into the public.
Finally, Part 6. Mental health and crisis resources. Before we wrap up, we just have to acknowledge the extremely heavy subject matter we've been discussing today. Clinical literature treats postpartum psychosis as a rare but very, very real psychiatric emergency. But it is so important to note that most people with mental illness, including postpartum depression, are never violent. Having intrusive thoughts does not mean a person will act on them. If you or someone you know is struggling, please know that help is available right now. The National Maternal Mental Health Hotline is 1-833-TLC-MAMA. For suicide or general mental health crisis, you can call or text 988. And of course, if there's immediate danger, please call 911. So this case leaves us with some truly profound legal and clinical questions. How on earth will the jury weigh a fragmented medical record, where psychosis wasn't explicitly observed by one provider, against the incredibly strict, two-pronged Massachusetts definition of criminal responsibility? The prosecution has to prove responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt, while the defense is pointing to a catastrophic systemic failure in her care. What evidence will ultimately tip the scales here? To find out, follow our verified trial tracker at CassianCreed.com. You can also grab a free guide to reading criminal cases while you're there. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely stay tuned as this trial continues to unfold.